Okay, what we want to do in this particular PowerPoint video is talk about the skin appendages, or things such as hair, hair follicles, sebaceous glands, which are basically oil glands, sudiferous glands, which are sweat glands, fingernails, toenails, as well as talk a little bit about how wounds heal, okay, which might be very helpful in regards to talking about the skin. They have to heal. What are some of these epidermal appendages, like I mentioned? These are appendage means just a structure that's additional to the skin. Again, hair, various glandular structures, oil glands, sweat glands, as well as nails. Okay, and that's what we'll talk about here. Let's talk first about hair. Okay, hair is in most areas of the body. There's a couple areas where we don't find it: palms, soles, things like that. We won't find hair. But what hair is basically, it has a shaft. Okay, and that shaft has an inner root. This up here, the diagram that we have up at the top shows what a hair shaft looks like. There's an inner root that goes the entire length all the way down to the bottom portion, which is called the bulb, which is embedded in the dermis, okay, which is surrounded by a medulla, okay, which is around the root, which is surrounded by a cortex, which is around the medulla, and then a cuticle, which is around that. And this hair sits in what's called a follicle. A follicle would be the channel or the tube in which that hair would sit. Okay, it's called the follicle. And then at the deep portion, where quote the root of the hair is, that's the hair bulb. The hair bulb is this area down there, and the hair bulb actually has metabolically active cells that are actually able to generate new hair cells. Okay, so when one gets pulled out, if you pull it out by the root, it may not come back the same way. Or when they do laser epilation, what they do is they'll actually try to burn it down all the way through the root so it won't come back. Okay, but once there's some root material there, the hair will be regenerated. We also find that associated with the hair and the hair follicle are oil glands or sebaceous glands. And these sebaceous glands basically actually allow an oily material to leak in, and it goes right inside the follicle. The sebaceous gland actually has an exit into the follicle, so it keeps the hair shaft flexible and nice and sort of oily, okay, to keep it flexible so it doesn't become brittle and just break off, okay. The hair root also has or the hair itself near the root will also have a plexus, a nerve plexus for sensation. Okay, this is important because what happens, the hair can actually be sort of tactile. We actually feel things as it moves the hair. Why? Because it's attached and along the follicle and of course to the area of the root or the bulb, with a nerve supply that will determine the motion of the hair. Also with the hair, there's a muscle that's attached to the side of it. It's called the erector pili muscle, which is basically still in the dermis, and that will allow the hair, when the erector pili fires, it actually allows it pulls on the shaft and actually lets the hair stand straight up. So basically that's what we see with hair. Again, we have the hair shaft, which is multiple layers thick. The hair shaft sits in a follicle. Going into the follicle are sebaceous glands or oil glands that keep the hair lubricated and moist and flexible. And then also there are sensory fibers around the hair that will be able to detect motion of that hair, as well as we also have a muscle which is called the erector pili, which actually has the hair stand on end, and stand erect during certain situations. Okay, so that's a little bit about that here. And let's just look at a hair follicle. Probably the best follicle that you actually see looking at all this is this one right here, because you actually see the follicle or the opening, as well as you see the hair shaft inside there. Here would be the area of the bulb or the root of the hair. Erector pili muscle would be up in here. That will actually cause it to stand erect and to come up. If we look at the picture on the left, you can see the hair follicle. It's in here with the hair shaft that would be in there. The erector pili muscle, which attaches to the area that will pull the hair straight up. We also find the sebaceous glands. Here's a sebaceous gland right there, and actually will have a duct that leads into that area, the hair follicle, that will be able to allow to keep the hair nice and moist. Okay, so basically that's what we see with hair. Okay, glandular structures. probably the first glandular structure we should talk about are sebaceous glands, and these are oil glands, okay? And they're, again, they're right by the hair follicles, and they will actually keep the hair shaft moist, okay, inside that follicle. So it keeps the hair pliable. Also, the sebaceous glands, as they exit out into the air of the skin, either through the follicle, the hair follicle, or whatever the case may be, it keeps this, it creates a protective layer, and like an oily layer on the surface of the skin. And that oily layer actually does provide a barrier protection, from things such as bacteria and viruses and stuff like that, as well as it provides a little bit of an evaporation barrier for heat dissipation, okay? We don't find these sebaceous glands or oil glands in the palms of the soles. Palms of the soles get wet because something else, which is called which are the sweat glands, which we'll talk about next. But there's a sebaceous gland. We'll see it right there, leading into an area of a hair follicle, and here's another sebaceous gland right there, going into an area of a hair follicle. Now, the other follicles, or the other glands that we have, are called sudiferous glands, and sudiferous glands are sweat glands, okay? These sweat glands are almost everywhere in the body, okay? Almost all places. And basically, they're there to excrete waste, to get things to the outside. They're also important in temperature regulation. We talked about this before when we talked about some of the initial function of skin, that if I want to dissipate heat, I'll sweat more. And the reason why I sweat more is now I get the sweat that gets on the surface of my skin, and that evaporates according to the temperature. One of the problems we find with people with heat stroke is when they have heat stroke occurs when the temperature is high, as well as high humidity. And if there's high humidity or high moisture in the air, we don't have the evaporation of the sweat at the surface of the skin, so that therefore we don't get that evaporative process to decrease body temperature. And these people, the core body temperature will continue to rise, okay? Now we have a couple different types of sudiferous glands, sweat glands. One gland is called the eccrine sweat gland, okay? And this is almost everywhere in the body, okay? Hands, the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, they're everywhere. And these actually are small little corkscrew-like glands that exit directly to the surface of the skin. They exit directly to the surface of the skin. We'll talk a little bit more about those in saying that what happens is the eccrine sweat glands, again, they're most in there's a large concentration of palms and the soles, but they're everywhere else. And what happens is they're largely the ones that involve for cooling. The secretions are very watery, okay? And again, it's mostly for heat dissipation and stuff like that we find with the eccrine sweat gland. Both the eccrine and the apocrine sweat glands are called exocrine, which means that they produce their secretions in a gland and secrete them out to a duct, as compared to endocrine, which is basically making something in the gland and secreting it out through the bloodstream, okay? So these eccrine sweat glands are basically the typical everyday run-of-the-mill sweat glands we all have all over the place in the body. Apocrine sweat glands are a little bit different. Apocrine sweat glands basically are a little thicker. They're a little bit more viscous, okay? And what we find is apocrine sweat glands are more in locations such as the axillary region of the armpit, the groin creases around the area of the anal region. And what happens is because they're of a different composition, okay? Also around the eyelids, we'll find some of these apocrine sweat glands around the eyelids. Because they're of a little bit different composition, what happens is the bacteria will actually act upon the secretions from apocrine sweat glands, and that's what and the destruction of the apocrine sweat, okay, which is a little bit different. And the way that the apocrine sweat glands actually secrete are out through hair follicles as well, okay? That's why they're in the axillary region, inguinal crease, and around the anus and stuff like that. But what happens is they're a little bit more oily nature. They're a little bit different composition of the apocrine sweat, and as a result, the bacteria will feast on them. The bacteria like the apocrine sweat, and when the bacteria start to destroy the apocrine sweat, that's what causes the odor that would occur with that type of sweat. Eccrine sweat basically is more odorless sweat. It's basically for evaporation, and apocrine basically in hairy areas, because now the gland exits into a hair follicle, and then the bacteria act upon that. The bacteria then destroy it, and that causes the odor. So those are the two different types of glands we see. Oh, I should have shown you the back one before. What happens if we look at those, if you go back, and actually you can see it right in here, you see it right there, you see it right there. These are eccrine sweat glands. Hard to catch those because they're basically tubes. They're coiled tubes and they come up. So you can't really do a microscope, a section of the of the skin to be able to see these really well. So you sort of catch them when these coiled tubes, they go across the area where it's being caught. And so you see there, and you see there's probably, when you look, if you look really close, what do we see that usually surrounds little ducts? Frequently those little simple cuboidal cells. The little cuboidal cells will surround the duct, like we saw when we talked about tissue and we talked about epithelial tissue, because again, the ducts are basically epithelial tissues because they're coverings or linings. Okay, so here we see some eccrine sweat glands. We're sort of catching at a tangent or an angle. Same thing with right down there. While we're here, we can also see here's a sebaceous gland, and if you look at it, it looks very lipidy inside there because that sebaceous gland again is what? Fat. Okay, fat and oil. So basically that's why we see all these looking like fat cells. They're inside there. You can see some more eccrine sweat glands down there. And then up in here, we see apocrine glands. And again, you can't tell the difference. You'd have to actually know where they are and where they're going to tell the difference between how the glands look. But that's just an apocrine and eccrine sweat glands. We also have a modification of these glands. They're called ceruminous glands, okay? So they're modified sweat glands, and these are the ones we find in the ears. And that creates, they're in the ear canal, in the tissues of the skin, the dermis of the ear canal, and basically it creates more of a sticky, waxier type of a secretion, which is basically, quote, that earwax. Or the name for earwax, the medical name is cerumen, C-E-R-U-M-I-N, cerumen. So, or C-E-R-U-M-E-N, you can see it's spelled both ways, but that's cerumen, okay, and that's the earwax, okay, and that's more of a stickier type of a secretion, more waxy like, so therefore that's what we see in the ears, and that's a special type of a sudiferous gland. Let's talk a little about the nails here, and the nail is sort of interesting because what happens is the nail is metabolically active, but only in a certain area. If you look at your fingernails, look down at your fingernails, and what happens is, unless you're sitting there with no shoes on, you can look at your toenails, I don't care either way. But if you look where the nail comes, where it starts more back in the area of the finger, okay? If I'm looking at this picture right here, this would be the tip of the toe out here, and this is back. If you looked in this area right in here, sometimes you'll see something that looks like a little half moon, okay? A little half moon, and that area is called the lunula, the lunula. Lunar means, or lunar means moon, and it's like a little half moon area, and that area is it's sort of soft, okay. It's more of a specialized type, almost like cartilaginous feeling. It's sort of, you actually take it, you can bend it a little bit easier, and that has metabolically active cells in there. So the nail actually starts, and the cells that are actually producing the nail start in this area, and they work their way out. Just like the epidermis started at the basal layer and worked its way out, okay? The same thing happens, the nail starts to go here, makes more cells here, it pushes the cells forward, and therefore the nail grows in length from the area of this nail root, or the area of the lunula, outwards, okay? So that lunula is called the matrix. It's called the matrix. That nail root area is called the matrix, and we do see it a little bit, that little fold right there, okay? If I looked at this diagram right here, okay, this little fold right here is called the proximal nail fold, okay? That's right where the nail, the back part of the nail, comes to the area of the tissue, okay? That's the area of the proximal nail fold, okay? And then what happens is the rest of the nail out here is called the nail body, okay? The area out at the end is called the free edge, okay? Around the edge of the nail, there's also some stratum corneum, okay? Stratum corneum, which we all know that is, it's that thicker skin on the outside, or this thicker layer of the epidermis, and that goes around the area of the nail, and that's that cuticle, or the medical term with that would be eponychium, okay? Underneath the free edge out in here of the nail, okay, let me get rid of all my pictures out here. If I look at the edge of the nail out here that sticks over the end, underneath here is called the hyponychium. It's the hyponychium. It's under that free edge, okay? Now, if we look and lifted the nail up, the part underneath the nail is called the nail bed. Okay, that nail bed is very vascular. I can't tell you the number of toenails and stuff like that that I've taken off, and they bleed a lot. Okay, you ever know if you banged your nail, all of a sudden it changes. You get that dark blue to black color underneath there, and that's all the blood that collects between the nail plate on the top and the nail bed on the bottom. Okay, so those are the parts of the nail that we have. We have the nail root, which is back in here. Okay, and you see that little area in there called the lunule, a little like half moon shaped area, which is very soft. Once you take the nail out, you can actually take it, and it actually looks, the nail would look something like this. Okay, comes back, and that nail fold sits like here, like this. The nail fold's here, and this right there on the sides of the nail. This is the end of the toenail right here, end right here. Then what happens is the nail actually comes back and comes way back underneath there, probably about a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch. Nails like this, and then that lunula sits out like in this area right here, and this area right here is that metabolically active area of the nail, where the nail is going to grow outwards this way from the area of the lunula or the nail bed. Okay. This is just like a cross section where they've cut the nail down this way, okay? And you can see the nail plate out in here. This is all the nail plate. This area right here is the nail plate. Here's that proximal nail fold. Here's that matrix. The lunular area would be out in here. Here's the nail bed that was sitting down underneath there, okay? And you can't see here. This is the hyponychium right here, which connects the nail underneath that free edge, because this right here would be called the free edge. Underneath there, underneath that nail. This would be the cuticle, or the eponychium would be here and around both sides of the nail. Okay, and that's what we see with the nail. Let me just mention a few things about wound healing. Okay, we mentioned this a little bit before. Wounds heal different if they're in the epidermis versus the dermis. In the epidermis, you got to remember that along that basement membrane, I have that stratum basale, stratum germinativum, where the cells are constantly multiplying. So as a result, if I do have a cut or a defect that's down into there, what happens, I can continue to make these cells. These cells will eventually fill this gap, and then they will mature because I'll have more and more cells, and the wound will heal from the bottom up. Okay, and they heal by what's called cell migration. So what will happen is these basal cells, or the basale cells, will work across that gap, fill this gap, and then continue to multiply and to have the nail actually start to grow out. Okay, or excuse me, have the wound actually start to heal from the bottom up. Okay, once one side meets the other side, it stops, and that's called contact inhibition. Okay, and then so what happens is then you create a layer in here. That layer then creates another layer, and then you regenerate all those individual layers of the epidermis. It fills the tissue normally, and there's no scar, which is an advantage in regards to very superficial wounds. If you get cut, scraped, something like that, and it's not down through that area called the basement membrane, if it stays outside the basement membrane, what's going to happen is it'll fill in from the bottom up with normal looking cells, and there's no scar. Okay, piece of cake. That's a good point. On the other hand, if I have deeper wounds, and now that wound goes down through that basement membrane, here'd be the basement membrane here, I go down through that basement membrane, we have a problem, simply because the cells that are actively dividing are here. You got to remember that when I get down into connective tissue, which is in my dermis we know is mostly connective tissue, what do we know about that? Lots of matrix, few cells. So I have to send some cells in to do something. So as a result, what happens is wounds that actually go down through the basement membrane, here it's been violated from here to here, down through the basement membrane, they have to heal in different ways, and it goes through longer stages of healing. Okay, multiple stages, going through an inflammatory phase, and I'll talk about these: a migratory phase, a proliferative phase, and a maturation phase. However, because I don't have a way for those little basal cells to jump that gap from one side to the other, they don't get across that. Basically what we're going to do is going to heal, and now in this case with a scar. So how does this happen? Well, first of all, we go through an inflammatory phase. An inflammatory phase, what happens is inflammation causes a vasodilation. The blood vessels will dilate, okay? And that's a good thing, okay? Because what happens is the blood vessels dilate, they become more permeable, things start to leak out. And that's why in new wounds, they appear red, they appear swollen, they appear hot, and with pain. that pain is because of chemicals are released like prostaglandins, bradykinin, and all kinds of chemicals that actually cause pain in that area, okay? And histamine as well. We talked about histamine before as causing as a vasodilator. Okay, so this increases the vascular permeability. What that does, it does a couple things. Number one, it brings in phagocytes. Now, phago we talked about means eat, cyte means cell. These are cells that come in like macrophages. They come in, walk, and they eat all the debris, all the dead. Because you got to remember that a lot of these cells are going to die, and there's going to be a lot of garbage that has to be cleaned up. So these macrophages or phagocytes come in, and they eat away all that material that's in there. So they help to clean the wound out, but clean out the debris. Okay. At this time also, because blood's being leaked out, what happens is a clot forms, okay? And a clot actually is a biological dressing that actually prevents other things like bacteria and stuff like that from getting in. So you shouldn't be picking off the scabs and stuff like that. And a lot of that clot material, there's some red blood cells that are in there, as well as a lot of plasma. That plasma, if you ever notice when you get a scrape, sometimes you get that sort of yellowish to orangish slippery fluid, and that's basically almost like a plasma material, very similar in constituency as we find to blood plasma, and basically that creates a little seal, part of that scab that we get on top, and that's the inflammatory phase. So it's causing a vasodilation to bring in cells that are going to start to eat things up. Also, it brings in cells for further stages down the road. Okay, at this point what happens is it also brings in things called fibroblasts. And the fibroblasts are the ones we talked about earlier when we talked about connective tissue that start to lay down a fibrous matrix, you know, things like strands that are going to go across the wound. Okay, so the cells will migrate, and what happens is we'll have migration across this open void now. Okay, and again, in this migratory phase with these fibroblasts, they actually lay down strands of collagen from side to side, and cells could actually have a lattice work on which they could move across. Okay, and they stop by contact inhibition. When the cells from one side meet the cells from the other side, they stop. Okay, what happens is on the outside there's still a scab that still provides a biological barrier or biological dressing on the outside. Again, that fibroblast underneath is still continuing to make those fibers, the collagen fibers and everything else, those strands. They're knitting everything together from the dermis, and then once I get the dermis, then I can start to create layers on top that will fill in the gap to the epidermis. Okay, this area is called granulation tissue. When you look at a wound, sometimes you'll see a lot of extra tissue that forms in the wound, and that's called granulation tissue. Sometimes you'll hear it called proud flesh if there's too much of it. I know I've seen a lot of leg ulcers and stuff like that. When we look at these leg ulcers, sometimes there's so much garbage material, tissue inside there that's building up that actually inhibits healing. We used to have to sometimes scrape that stuff out or clean all that stuff out, because if you didn't, it would never heal. Okay, so this is basically these fibroblasts are just making lots and lots of strands on which these cells can start to migrate across, so they could fill in the gap, fill in the void, and that's called the migratory phase. That migratory phase then concludes or blends into what's called the proliferative phase. And the proliferative phase, what happens is mitosis starts to ramp itself up. We have more and more mitosis occurring, and cells are dividing. One cell becomes two, that other cell becomes two more, that other cell becomes two more, and as a result, we start to get more thickening of the epidermis. And we also find that when we also cut not just the tissue, but we cut the blood vessels. So what happens is now these blood vessels have to connect inside there, and smaller blood vessels will start to bud, and they work their way across that wound until they finally meet to create a blood supply to that area, because the blood supply is important to bring in things like fibroblasts and stuff like that to be able to lay down new tissue. Then finally we get to what's called a maturation phase, which is near the end. Okay, and the idea here is this is a period of time, could be variable in length, where the skin is trying to get back to its normal appearance, that normal strata, that normal layers of the epidermis and the dermis, trying to get organized better so it looks like more skin, more normal skin like it should be. However, what we do find is because of this longer process and the fibroblasts and filling the gap and all kinds of stuff like that, we have scar and fibrosis. That's why you'll have on deeper wounds, you'll find a little bit of scar that's there. Okay, and again, the larger the wound, the more scar you're probably going to get. Okay, So the scar depends upon the extent of the wound and how stable it is during healing. That's why what happens if you leave a wound, an open wound, a gaping wound, guess what? Eventually it will fill in. It fills in from the bottom up eventually, but it takes a long time, and the scar is usually much more unattractive. But if they take it and either glue the ends of the wound together, which they use a wound glue now, or sew it together, suture it closed, and bring those two edges so there's not much movement, it allows healing to occur faster. Why? Because if there's movement in the tissue, you got to remember I'm building those fibers across, as well as I'm trying to reestablish those blood vessels going across that void. And if it moves, it breaks them. So as a result, we want to try to prevent that from happening, okay? If there's a lot of movement, or some people just have a tendency to form larger scars, and sometimes we get what's called a hypertrophic scar. Hyper means excessive, trophic means development. Hypertrophic scar is a larger scar. Some people actually are what are called keloid formers, and keloids are scars that go way above and beyond. These are like monster scars, you know? Sometimes you'll see people, you'll actually see the scar where they actually put the needle in to sew the wound. Okay, and sometimes it's because certain chemicals that are in the skin that actually will make this happen, which is frequently a genetic abnormal what protein, okay, which actually causes this abnormal scar to occur. Also, wounds that have a lot of motion are going to have more scar. Okay. We talked about, and that's about how wounds heal. We talked about thermoregulation a little bit, and I won't spend much time on this. And basically what happens is when we want to dissipate heat, okay, it's done in the skin by two ways. First of all, by dilation of blood vessels. If I dilate the blood vessel, I could actually radiate heat from the surface of the skin. Okay, so we actually lose heat via radiation. The heat gets dissipated through the surface of the skin because now I've sent a lot of blood there. The blood is warm, and it's dissipating the heat from there. Okay, then they have constriction in the dermis to conserve the heat if there is cold, if we're exposed to cold. Okay, so what happens is again, the epidermis. How much blood supply is there to the epidermis? Right. None. So as a result, what happens is the dermis, I constrict the blood vessels, and by constricting the blood vessels, I decrease that blood flow that actually cools that tissue. And it's okay, because maybe I can sacrifice the outside layers, because what's the intention? If we're getting too cold, keep that core temperature, the center body temperature, stable and normal, okay? So it shunts blood to deeper structures. We need it for that organ stabilization, to keep the organs with the amount of blood supply and the warmth that they need for normal operational purposes, okay? We also, in the skin, have a sweat response. We talked about that before, and that's when we're trying to dissipate heat. If I want to get rid of the heat, I sweat. When you sweat through the, particularly through the eccrine sweat glands, the sweat comes to the outside. It puts a sweat layer on the surface of the skin that becomes evaporated, and that evaporation is a method of cooling, just like the radiator of the car. In other words, when we run water through the engine, okay, through tubes in the engine, and it goes through a radiator, and that radiator, the air that comes in the front through the radiator, will cool that water, okay, by evaporation. Okay. Anyway, a couple of the things I want to just mention about skin and aging, wrinkles. Okay. What happens? We find that collagen fibers become tangled with age. Okay, I'll show you. Okay, there you go. You could look and still. Here's some collagen fibers. They get tangled with age. Also, elastic fibers lose their elasticity. So that's why you get all those saggy areas that are there. They're not nearly as elastic. You see all these commercials now for all these skin agents. If you rub them on and stuff like that, what happens is it tightens up the skin. It increases the elasticity of skin to make it look 3 months younger or something like that. So as a result, what happens is when the collagen fibers become tangled and you lose the elasticity, the skin becomes wrinkled. Poor guy. Okay. Also, we find that as people get older, they lose some subcutaneous and dermal tissue. It gets narrower, gets thinner. They have less protection, okay, and less insulation, okay, and the skin appears thin. If you look at some old people, what happens? Their skin looks like it's paper thin. You look at it, it's very, very thin looking skin, and the reason why is they've lost most of their subcutaneous tissue as well as a lot of the dermis mass, and as a result, the skin appears thin with aging. An important thing. Also, we find within aging, there's a reduction of oil production. oil gets reduced. And as a result, hair gets drier, skin gets drier, becomes more brittle and more prone to abrasion and stuff like that. Sweat glands don't function the same way. In older people, there's a problem with heat regulation because we've talked about how the sweat glands are important in regards to heat regulation. Also, melanocytes change. They become less active, with abnormal melanocytes. So that just a little bit about pigmentation. Also, one other thing I should mention about skin and aging is the immune system is decreased as you get older. As you get older, your immune system's not nearly as good as it was before. As a result, older individuals, they have poorer, slower healing times. If they have a wound, it's going to take longer to heal, okay? Also, there's the increased susceptibility to superficial infections, which if you've worked in a nursing home and stuff like that, you'll recognize is not an uncommon problem. Also, because of the loss of the subcutaneous tissue and the dermal thickness, what happens is sometimes small little rubbing, just rubbing of the skin, will actually cause what's left of the dermis to actually move a lot, which actually breaks a lot of the capillaries. So it's not unusual to see in a lot of older individuals a lot of bruises, in hands and areas of arms and stuff like that from minimal trauma. Why? Because there's not much protection, and any kind of movement of the skin, which has been changed from things we talked about before, a movement of the skin will actually cause a problem in regards to the skin sort of like sliding on itself, which rips some of those capillaries, which then causes a problem, okay? And these are just some of the problems that we get with skin. So what we've talked about so far in this well, this is the end of the skin. What we've talked about with the integumentary system here is that the appendages are there for a purpose. The hair, the sudiferous glands, basically for sweat, sebaceous glands for oil and lubrication, as well as nails. Okay, they're protective. You could live without nails, believe me. Toenails are basically only there for somebody to paint or whatever, I don't know. It doesn't affect your ambulation one way, shape, or form at all. Toenails don't affect it one way, one iota, nothing at all, okay? In the hands, they're much more important because what happens, the fingernails in the hands allow you to grasp or to pinch things. So picking things up are a little bit helpful with the fingernails. So we try to preserve the fingernails, but toenails, if you lose a toenail, big deal. I know with running, if I'd run, sometimes I'd lose a toenail, or if I do a long run, or sometimes if I played hockey, I'd get the edge of my toenail caught in the toe of my skate. It would push the nail back, and next thing you know, I'd come in, and my foot inside of my boot would be all full of blood. And basically, it was because the nail was getting pushed back, where the nail plate was pushed back on the area of the nail bed, which caused all this capillary tissue in that nail bed to start to rip. And basically, it separated the nail plate from the nail bed. Nail would come off, and and once you do that, you actually injure that matrix, that root area, which means that when the nail wants to come back, it usually doesn't come back nearly the same. Okay, comes back a little bit worse. So anyway, that's what we see with the nails. Talked about aging, we talked about wound healing. All these things are very important, and they all have something to do with how the structure of the skin as well as the skin appendages are. So hopefully this made sense to you. Again, like in all these other videos, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. You probably saw my wife go by in the middle. She didn't, or somewhere during the lecture. She didn't know that I guess I was doing a recording now. So that's her. You always say hi if you ever see her. So you probably don't recognize she's talking to my son, I think. But anyway, if you have any questions, you could always give me a call and talk to me about that. If you see my wife at the mall, you could, when we finally get back out and you can say hello if you want. But also, again, if you have any questions, let me know. Okay. Hopefully you learned something. In the meantime, before the next video, please stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll talk to you then. Bye-bye.